Captain Stevens arrived late, still in uniform but more relaxed than Ashley had ever seen him. He'd just finished teaching a class at the police academy, sharing lessons learned from his own transformation. "We added something new to the training," he told the group. "Every cadet has to spend time in the community they'll serve, not as an officer, but as a neighbor. Learning the stories, understanding the people." As the evening wound down, Ashley's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rivera. 3 more precincts had requested help setting up similar programs. The ripples were still spreading. Walking home under the streetlights, Ashley passed the spot where she'd been pulled over all those months ago. A patrol car slowed beside her, but this time the officer just waved and called out a friendly greeting. She waved back, remembering her mother's words about pebbles and ripples. The next morning, she found Captain Stevens in his office early, reviewing community feedback forms. On his desk sat the old photo from the basketball game 5 years ago, now joined by new ones, pictures of recent community events, the Youth League, the Oversight Committee. "Sometimes," he said, noticing her looking at the photos, "it takes someone believing in who you used to be to remind you of who you can still become." Ashley smiled, thinking of all the changes, big and small. "It's not about forgetting the past," she replied. "It's about learning from it, growing from it, and then doing better." Outside, another day was beginning at the 12th Precinct. Officers headed out on their beats, greeting residents by name. The community room was being set up for a senior citizens' coffee morning. Young recruits arrived for their community orientation. And in every interaction, in every small moment of respect and understanding, the truth was clear. Real change hadn't come from force or fear, but from people on all sides remembering their shared humanity and choosing, day by day, to do better. 6 months had passed since the hearing. The 12th Precinct's community room buzzed with activity as people gathered for the monthly Oversight Committee meeting. The old vending machines had been replaced with a coffee station, and the walls now displayed photos of community events alongside official notices. Captain Stevens stood by the window, watching kids play basketball on the newly renovated court outside. Officer Rodriguez had started a youth league, and even on his days off, Stevens came to watch the games. Something about seeing the kids play reminded him of why he'd become an officer in the first place. "Quite a change from last year," Ashley said, joining him at the window. She'd just finished reviewing the latest statistics: civilian complaints down by 60%, community engagement up by 80%, and officer satisfaction scores at an all-time high. "I never thanked you properly," Stevens said quietly. "Not just for exposing what was wrong, but for showing us how to make it right." The Oversight Committee meeting began, with residents and officers sitting side by side. Mrs. Chen, now the committee's vice chair, led a discussion about expanding the community outreach programs to neighboring precincts. "The basketball league is just the beginning," Officer Rodriguez reported. "We're starting a mentorship program next month. Already have 15 officers volunteering their time." Mr. Washington shared updates about the new civilian patrol program, where residents worked alongside officers to keep their neighborhoods safe. "It's not us versus them anymore," he explained. "Now it's just us, all of us working together." After the meeting, Ashley walked through the precinct halls. The change was visible everywhere, in the way officers greeted visitors, in the new suggestion box that was actually read and responded to, in the diversity training certificates proudly displayed on walls. She passed the front desk where her story had begun. The officer there, the same one who'd dismissed her months ago, now spent his shifts teaching other precincts how to improve their civilian interaction protocols. In the break room, she found Captain Stevens talking with a group of new recruits. "Remember," she heard him say, "every person who walks through that door is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's neighbor. Treat them that way." Mayor Thompson had turned the 12th Precinct's transformation into a model for the entire city. Other precincts sent officers to observe and learn. Community leaders from different neighborhoods came to study the programs. Even other cities started calling, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. At home that evening, Ashley found another stack of letters, more stories, more thanks, more people inspired to speak up and work for change in their own communities. But the letter that touched her most came from Captain Stevens' daughter. "Thank you for helping my dad find himself again," she wrote. "He's the person I remember from when I was little, the one who believed in protecting and serving everyone, not just some." Later that week, Ashley stopped by Mrs. Chen's apartment. The elderly woman was hosting her weekly dinner for officers and neighbors, another tradition that had sprung up during the changes. Officer Rodriguez was there with his family, and Mr. Washington had brought his famous peach cobbler. "You know what I love most?" Mrs. Chen said, serving Ashley a plate of dumplings. "The children in the neighborhood don't hide when they see a police car anymore. Now they wave." Not everything went smoothly. Some officers requested transfers. A few community members remained skeptical. But slowly, conversation by conversation, things shifted. 1 month after the hearing, Ashley stopped by the precinct to file a follow-up report. The same desk officer who had barely looked at her before now greeted her by name. In the hallway, she heard laughter. Captain Stevens was in the community room, playing chess with Mr. Washington while several officers and residents watched. "You know what the best part is?" Officer Rodriguez said, falling into step beside her. "The other precincts are starting to call. They want to know how to set up similar programs before they have their own crisis." Ashley smiled, remembering something her mother always said: "Change is like a pebble in a pond. You never know how far the ripples will reach." That evening, she sat in her favorite coffee shop, updating her case notes. The TV above the counter showed footage from another city where similar reforms were being discussed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rivera. "2 more precincts just volunteered for review. Want to help?" Outside, she could see Officer Thompson, no relation, chatting with Mrs. Chen as he walked his beat. The officer paused to help her carry her groceries, both of them laughing at some shared joke. It was a small moment, but exactly the kind of interaction that had been missing before. Real change, Ashley thought, doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as people remembering how to be neighbors again. The morning headlines splashed across every local newspaper. "Mayor's daughter exposes police discrimination." Channel 5 news vans lined up outside the 12th precinct, reporters clutching microphones in the early morning chill. But inside her apartment, Ashley ignored the media frenzy, focusing instead on a different kind of message. Her phone kept buzzing with texts and emails from people sharing their own stories. A teacher wrote about how the hearing had given her courage to report her own experience. A teenager sent a video of his youth group discussing police reform. Even retired officers reached out, offering support and suggestions for improvement. "You've started something big," Mrs. Chen said, bringing her usual morning dumplings. Today, she wasn't alone. She brought Mr. Washington from the community center and several other neighbors. They gathered around Ashley's small kitchen table, sharing stories and ideas. "We need to make sure this momentum doesn't go to waste," Mr. Washington said, spreading out a map of the neighborhood. The precincts agreed to changes, but the community needs to be involved in making them work. At the precinct, Captain Stevens faced his own challenges. Some officers supported the changes, while others resisted. That morning's briefing was tenser than usual. "Things worked fine before," one veteran officer grumbled. "Why change everything because of one complaint?" "It wasn't just one complaint," Stevens replied, his voice firm. "And I was wrong. We were wrong. Now we have a chance to be better." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "I've drafted some suggestions for the new community engagement program, based on what worked before, but with improvements." Meanwhile, at City Hall, Mayor Thompson dealt with calls from other precincts across the city. "They're all worried they're next," she told Ashley over their weekly lunch. "Good, let them worry. Let them look at their own behaviors before someone has to force them to." The local news station requested interviews, but Ashley declined. Instead, she worked with community leaders to organize a town hall meeting. The precinct's community room, unused for years, was cleaned and opened for the event. The turnout surprised everyone. People filled every chair, stood along the walls, spilled out into the hallway. Captain Stevens, looking nervous but determined, took the podium first. "I won't make excuses," he began, "but I will make changes, real ones, and I need your help to do it right." One by one, community members stood up. They shared stories, not just complaints, but memories of how things used to be, hopes for how they could be again. A grandmother remembered when officers knew every kid's name. A shop owner talked about the coffee meetings they used to have with beat cops. "We're not asking for anything extraordinary," Ashley said when it was her turn to speak. just to be treated with basic respect and dignity, to be seen as people, not statistics or threats. The local paper's young reporter, Amy Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, captured the moment perfectly. It wasn't a meeting of police and civilians, but of neighbors remembering how to talk to each other. Over the next few weeks, changes began. The precinct's front desk was reorganized to be more welcoming. Officers started attending community events again. Captain Stevens enrolled in counseling and encouraged his officers to do the same. She laid copies on the commission's table. It's not about removing Captain Stevens. It's about helping him become the officer he used to be, the one who cared, who served, who protected everyone equally. The chairman reviewed the proposal, then looked at Stevens. "Captain, would you be willing to participate in such a program?" Stevens looked at the old photo again, then at Ashley. Something had changed in his eyes. The defensive wall was gone, replaced by something like hope. "Yes," he said firmly. "Yes, I would." As the hearing adjourned, people began filing out. Mrs. Chen caught Ashley's eye and smiled. Officer Rodriguez nodded respectfully to both Ashley and Stevens. The mayor stood talking quietly with the commissioners. And in the middle of it all, Captain Stevens approached Ashley. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Several, actually." Ashley looked at him thoughtfully. "Prove it," she said. "Not to me. To them." She gestured to the community members leaving the room. "They're the ones who need to trust you again." Stevens nodded, understanding the real work was just beginning. Outside, reporters waited with cameras and questions. But inside this room, something more important had happened, the first step toward real change, born not from force or fear, but from finally seeing each other as human beings. The police commission hearing room buzzed with tension. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. Captain Stevens sat at the front table, his usually crisp uniform looking slightly wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it. Ashley sat across the room, her evidence spread before her in neat stacks. "This hearing will come to order," the commission chairman announced, his gavel echoing through the suddenly quiet room. Mayor Thompson sat in the front row, her face neutral but her eyes alert, watching everything. Detective Rivera from Internal Affairs stepped forward first. "Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of discriminatory practices at the 12th Precinct," she began, projecting graphs onto the wall screen. Complaints increased by 200% over the past year, with clear demographic disparities in how cases were handled. Officer Rodriguez testified next, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "The atmosphere at the precinct changed. We were encouraged to be more proactive in certain neighborhoods, but less so in others. When we raised concerns, they were dismissed." Throughout the morning, more witnesses came forward. The young doctor who'd been repeatedly stopped. The business owner who'd been questioned outside his own store. Mrs. Chen, who spoke about watching her neighborhood change as trust in law enforcement eroded. Then it was Ashley's turn. She walked to the podium, feeling every eye in the room on her. But instead of starting with her own experience, she did something unexpected. "I'd like to show you something from 5 years ago," she said, pulling up an old newspaper article. On the screen appeared a photo of Captain Stevens at a community basketball game, surrounded by smiling kids. This was the real Captain Stevens, the one who cared about his community, the one who won awards for his outreach programs. She turned to face him directly. Then something changed. "Your partner was shot during a routine traffic stop. It was traumatic, devastating. And instead of getting help, you let it change how you saw the world, how you saw people." Stevens stared at the old photo, his face showing emotion for the first time. Ashley continued, her voice gentle but firm. "What happened to your partner was terrible. But look around this room. Every person here has a story about how your response to that trauma has affected their lives." The room was completely silent now. Ashley pulled out her original complaint form, the wrinkled one Stevens had dismissed without reading. This could have been a simple complaint about one traffic stop. Instead, it became about something much bigger. "Because when you refused to listen to me, you showed me I needed to listen to everyone else." One by one, she presented the evidence. Traffic stop data, patrol patterns, complaint statistics, internal emails. But between each piece of evidence, she shared a story. A human moment that showed the real impact of these policies. Captain, the commission chairman said finally, do you have anything to say in your defense? Stevens stood slowly, looking older than his years. He glanced at the old photo still projected on the wall, then at the faces around the room. His voice cracked. He took a deep breath and started again. I forgot who I was supposed to be. The admission hung in the air. Ashley felt her mother's hand squeeze her shoulder gently. After Tom, my partner, was shot, I was angry, scared. I started seeing threats everywhere. It was easier to distance myself, to stop seeing people as people. Stevens turned to face the room. I'm not defending what I did. I'm trying to understand it myself, because if I don't understand it, I can't change it. Mayor Thompson stood up. Perhaps that's where we start then. Not with punishment alone, but with understanding and change. The commission chairman nodded thoughtfully. Captain Stevens, this board will need to take appropriate disciplinary action, but we're also interested in solutions. Ms. Thompson, you've clearly done extensive research. What would you recommend? Ashley opened her final folder. I have a proposal. A comprehensive plan for rebuilding trust between the precinct and the community. It includes mandatory trauma counseling for officers, renewed community engagement programs, and a civilian oversight committee with real power. Mayor Thompson rubbed her temples, staring at the stack of monthly reports on her desk. The Police Oversight Committee's latest findings were troubling. Civilian complaints had increased by 40% at the 12th precinct. Something about Captain Stevens' name kept catching her eye, but she couldn't quite place why. Ma'am, her assistant poked her head in, your daughter's here for lunch. Ashley walked in carrying takeout bags from their favorite deli. It had been their tradition since Ashley was in law school. Wednesday lunches, just the two of them, no talk about work. But today felt different. You look tired, honey, the mayor said, clearing space on her desk for their sandwiches. Long case, Ashley replied, but her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped her food. The investigation had reached a critical point, and keeping it from her mother had become increasingly difficult. I've been reading some interesting reports, Mayor Thompson said casually, watching her daughter's face. About the 12th precinct. Ashley's sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. In that moment, everything changed. Their eyes met, and 28 years of mother-daughter understanding passed between them. How long have you known? Ashley asked quietly. That something was wrong at the precinct. Months. That you were involved. The pattern of complaints changed about 3 weeks ago. Became more organized, more detailed. Had your fingerprints all over it. The mayor smiled softly. You always were thorough. Ashley took a deep breath. I wanted to handle it properly, through the right channels. Not because I'm your daughter, but because it's right. Her mother nodded, pride visible in her eyes. Tell me everything. For the next hour, Ashley laid out the whole story, the traffic stop, Captain Stevens' dismissal, the investigation she'd built. She showed her mother the testimonies, the patterns of behavior, the evidence of systemic issues. And you did all this without using my name once, Mayor Thompson said thoughtfully. I learned from you, Mom. You always said true change comes from doing the work, not from wielding influence. Just then, the mayor's phone buzzed. The police commissioner was calling an emergency meeting. The internal affairs investigation had leaked to the press. It's happening faster than I planned, Ashley said, gathering her things quickly. I should go. No, her mother said firmly. It's time to stop hiding. Come to the meeting. The police commissioner's office was packed when they arrived. Captain Stevens stood near the window, his face pale as he read the morning's newspaper headlines. The internal affairs report lay open on the commissioner's desk. When Ashley walked in behind the mayor, the room fell silent. Captain Stevens looked up, confusion crossing his face, then shock as recognition dawned. You're, he started, looking between Ashley and the mayor. Ashley Thompson, she said clearly. The woman whose complaint you dismissed 3 months ago. And yes, Mayor Thompson is my mother, but that's not why I'm here. She opened her briefcase and pulled out her original complaint, along with dozens of others. I'm here because every person who walks into that precinct deserves to be heard, regardless of who they are or who they know. The commissioner picked up Ashley's file, then looked at Captain Stevens. Can to explain why this complaint never made it into the official records. Stevens' face had lost all color. I didn't think. That's right, Ashley said quietly. You didn't think. You didn't look at the evidence. You didn't listen. And it wasn't just me. Mayor Thompson stood by the door, watching proudly as her daughter commanded the room. This wasn't the mayor's daughter throwing her weight around. This was a skilled attorney presenting an irrefutable case. The 12th precinct used to be different, Ashley continued, pulling out the old community program files. Captain Stevens, you used to be different. What happened to the officer who won awards for community outreach? Who knew everyone's name? Who cared? Something shifted in Stevens' expression, a crack in the armor. For the first time, he really looked at Ashley, not as a complaint to be dismissed, but as a person asking a real question. The mayor finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of both official authority and maternal pride. We have two choices here. We can let this become a scandal that tears the department apart, or we can use it as an opportunity to rebuild trust and create real change. Captain Stevens, which would you prefer? The room held its breath, waiting for his answer. Outside, reporters were gathering, drawn by whispers of the story. But inside this room, something more important than headlines was happening, the moment when truth finally came face to face with power, and both had to decide what happened next. As she drove home that night, she passed the 12th precinct. The lights were still on in Captain Stevens' office. Tomorrow would bring another day of evidence gathering, another step closer to the truth. But tonight, Ashley said a quiet prayer, not for justice alone, but for understanding to prevail when the truth finally came to light. The Internal Affairs office was quieter than Ashley expected. Detective Rivera looked up from her computer as Ashley placed a thick folder on her desk. That's quite a file you've put together, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. 3 months of research, Ashley replied, taking a seat. Every complaint, every incident, all documented and cross-referenced. She'd spent countless nights organizing the evidence, making sure everything was perfect. Detective Rivera opened the folder and began reading. Her eyebrows raised slightly as she turned each page. You've been thorough, she said finally. But you know cases like this are complicated. I know, Ashley nodded. That's why I included statements from officers within the precinct too. Off the record, of course. They're worried about speaking up officially. The detective leaned back in her chair, studying Ashley carefully. You haven't used your mother's name once in this whole process. Most people would have led with that. Because this isn't about who my mother is, Ashley said firmly. It's about every person who walks into that precinct and deserves to be treated with respect. Meanwhile, at the 12th precinct, Captain Stevens was having a different kind of morning. Officer Rodriguez stood in his office, refusing to back down. Sir, these new patrol patterns you're suggesting, they're going to damage the community trust we've built. Trust doesn't solve crimes, Stevens snapped, but something flickered across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or an old memory. Later that afternoon, Ashley sat in her car outside the community center, watching people come and go. An elderly man walked up and tapped on her window. She recognized him as Mr. Washington, who ran the youth mentorship program. Heard you've been asking questions about the precinct, he said as she stepped out of the car. Got time for a story? Over coffee at the nearby diner, Mr. Washington shared his history with Captain Stevens. 5 years ago, he was different. Used to come to community events, knew everyone by name. Then there was that shooting. His partner got hurt badly in a traffic stop gone wrong. After that, something changed. Ashley wrote everything down, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The commendation for community outreach, she murmured. It was before the shooting. Back at her apartment, Ashley received an unexpected call from Carol at the records office. Found something else. Remember those shut-down community programs? Funding wasn't cut. It was redirected to enhanced security measures. The next day, Ashley visited 3 more businesses along Oak Street where she'd been stopped. The bookstore owner had security footage from that day. The cafe owner had witnessed similar stops. The mechanic had filed his own complaint months ago. Nothing came of it, he shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag. But you're different. You've got that look, like you're not going to let this go. That evening, Detective Rivera called. We're opening an official investigation. But Ashley, this is going to stir things up. Aren't you ready for that? Ashley looked at the photo on her wall. Her mother's inauguration as mayor. She remembered standing on that stage, watching her mother take the oath of office, promising to serve all citizens equally. "I've been ready my whole life," she answered. The next week was a whirlwind. Internal affairs investigators interviewed officers. Community members came forward with more stories. Officer Rodriguez quietly provided documentation of shift changes and patrol patterns. Captain Stevens noticed something was different. Officers were whispering in corners. Community members watched his patrol car with knowing looks, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed. Ashley kept working her regular cases at the law firm, but her lunch breaks were spent meeting witnesses. Her evenings were dedicated to organizing testimonies. Mrs. Chen kept bringing dumplings, now accompanied by worried looks and gentle advice about taking care of herself. One night, as she was leaving the office late, Ashley saw Captain Stevens at a small diner. He sat alone, staring into a coffee cup, looking older and more tired than she remembered. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Then she remembered all the people who'd been hurt by his actions and inactions. Sometimes she heard her mother's voice in her head. People forget who they wanted to be. Our job is to help them remember. The investigation was gaining momentum. Soon, very soon, everything would come to light. But Ashley had learned something important along the way. This wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It was about creating an opportunity for healing, for change, for everyone involved. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of City Hall as Mayor Patricia Thompson reviewed the day's final reports. Her desk was covered with proposals and policy documents, but her mind kept drifting to her daughter Ashley. They hadn't spoken much lately, both consumed by their demanding careers. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Ashley was building a case that would soon land on her desk. Back in her downtown apartment, Ashley sat cross-legged on her couch, surrounded by stacks of paper. Her laptop screen glowed with dozens of open tabs, civilian complaints, police reports, and department policies. She'd spent the last 3 hours reviewing similar incidents at the 12th precinct, and a disturbing pattern was emerging. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mother. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" Ashley stared at the message, her finger hovering over the keyboard. How easy it would be to tell her mother everything about the traffic stop, Captain Stevens' dismissive behavior, the discrimination she'd faced. The mayor could have the entire situation handled with one phone call. But that wasn't the right way, not for lasting change. "All good, Mom. Just busy with work. Let's have lunch next week." She set her phone down and picked up another complaint file. This one was from a young doctor who'd been stopped 3 times in 1 month while driving to the hospital for emergency calls. Another was from a business owner who'd been questioned aggressively while loading supplies into his own store. A knock at her door startled her. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, holding a plate of homemade dumplings. "You've been working too hard," the elderly woman said, shuffling into Ashley's apartment. "I see your lights on every night." Ashley smiled, clearing space on her coffee table. Mrs. Chen had been like a second mother since Ashley moved into the building, always watching out for her. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Actually, I could use your perspective on something." Over steaming dumplings, Ashley shared her experience at the precinct, carefully omitting her mother's position. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, her wise eyes understanding. "When I first came to this country 30 years ago," she said, "many doors were closed in my face. But I learned something important. Real change doesn't come from forcing doors open. It comes from showing people why they should want to open them." The words struck a chord. Ashley had been approaching this like a lawyer, gathering evidence for a conviction. But maybe there was a better way, one that could create genuine understanding rather than just forced compliance. She spent the next few hours reframing her approach. Instead of just collecting complaints, she began documenting positive interactions between officers and civilians too. She found cases where proper training had made a difference, where community engagement had built trust. These success stories could serve as blueprints for change. The next morning, Ashley bumped into Officer Rodriguez while getting coffee. She'd seen him around the neighborhood before. He was one of the good ones, always treating everyone with respect. Today, though, he looked troubled. "Everything okay?" she asked, genuinely concerned. He sighed, just thinking about some changes at the precinct. Captain Stevens is pushing for more proactive policing in certain neighborhoods. Some of us don't agree with his approach, but he trailed off, realizing he might have said too much. Ashley carefully wrote down their conversation later. It was another piece of the puzzle, showing that even within the department, there were officers who wanted better relationships with the community. That afternoon, she received an email from Carol at the records office. Found something interesting in the 2019 files. Captain Stevens received a commendation for community outreach programs, but they were all shut down 6 months later. No explanation given. Ashley leaned back in her chair, thinking. People didn't just change overnight. Something had happened to turn a community-oriented captain into someone who dismissed civilian complaints without a second thought. Understanding that transformation might be key to reversing it. Her mother's weekly press conference played on her laptop in the background. Mayor Thompson was discussing plans for community development, her voice strong and confident. Ashley smiled, remembering how her mother had taught her to fight for what's right, but to do it with wisdom and grace. Sometimes, her mother always said, the quietest moves make the loudest impact. Ashley looked at her growing collection of evidence and testimonies. Soon, very soon, Captain Stevens would learn who she was. But by then, it wouldn't be about her identity or her mother's position. It would be about something much bigger, the chance to transform a broken system from within. Rain pattered against the windows of the 12th Precinct Police Station as Ashley Thompson straightened her charcoal gray blazer and gripped her leather portfolio tighter. The young attorney had just wrapped up a major corporate case, but this visit was personal. Her heart pounded as she pushed open the heavy glass doors, remembering the unfair traffic stop that brought her here. The police station buzzed with typical afternoon activity. Officers shuffled papers at their desks, phones rang in the background, and the smell of coffee wafted through the air. Ashley approached a front desk, where an officer barely glanced up from his computer screen. "I need to file a complaint," she said firmly, maintaining her professional composure despite her growing unease. The officer pointed her toward a door marked Captain Stevens without saying a word. Ashley had prepared meticulously for this moment. In her portfolio, she carried detailed notes about the traffic stop, how the officer had followed her luxury car for several blocks, how he'd questioned whether the vehicle really belonged to her, and how he'd made thinly veiled comments about her presence in an upscale neighborhood. She also had dashcam footage that proved her complete compliance during the entire interaction. The captain's office door was open. Inside, Captain Stevens sat behind a large desk, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his uniform pristine. He didn't look up as Ashley entered, continuing to type on his keyboard. "Take a seat," he said flatly, still not making eye contact. Ashley sat down, placed her portfolio on her lap, and began. "Good afternoon, Captain. I'm here to file a formal complaint about a traffic stop that occurred 3 days ago on Oak Street." The captain finally looked up, his expression shifting from disinterest to dismissal as his eyes fell on her. "Another complaint? Let me guess. You feel you were targeted." "Sir, I have documentation, including video evidence." Ashley started to open her portfolio. "Listen, miss," Captain Stevens cut her off, leaning back in his chair. "We get these complaints all the time. My officers are highly trained professionals who follow proper protocols. Maybe you were speeding and didn't realize it, or perhaps you misunderstood the officer's standard questions." Ashley felt her legal training kick in as she maintained her composure. "With all due respect, Captain, I'm very aware of my rights and—" "I'm sure you think you are," he interrupted again, his tone condescending. "But police work is complex. We have procedures and protocols that civilians don't always understand. Now, if you were actually mistreated, which I highly doubt, you can fill out this form." He slid a wrinkled complaint form across his desk without even bothering to smooth it out. "I'm an attorney," Ashley stated calmly, "and I'm well versed in proper police procedures. The officer's actions clearly violated department policy regarding—" The captain stood up suddenly, his chair rolling backward. "I think we're done here. If you want to file a complaint, fill out the form. Otherwise, please stop wasting police time and resources. We have real crimes to solve." Ashley sat perfectly still, her hand steadily recording every word in her notebook. The captain's dismissive attitude, his refusal to look at her evidence, and his interruptions painted a clear picture of prejudice. What he didn't know, what she deliberately hadn't mentioned, was that her mother's office was just 2 buildings away at City Hall. As she gathered her things to leave, Ashley noticed a family photo on the captain's desk. He smiled broadly in it, standing proudly next to his daughter at her college graduation. The irony wasn't lost on her. He was a man who clearly loved his own daughter, but couldn't see past his biases to treat someone else's daughter with basic respect. Walking out of the precinct, Ashley pulled out her phone and made a single call. "Hi, Carol. Yes, this is Ashley Thompson. Could you please send me all civilian complaints filed against the 12th precinct in the last 3 years? Yes, the complete records." She paused, looking back at the building. "And Carol? Let's keep this between us for now. I don't want anyone knowing the mayor's daughter is asking."